So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, as we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. So then as the news then we find then many more areas of information from Galah. We then have discovered the United States has then relinquished then the leadership of the market of this time and had taken this nation roughly 36 months to get themselves away from the desire of making the entire statue of gold, as you can read the Daniel then the 3rd chapter. Not only this, but then Galah has shown us a very interesting point, because as we then are in the hands of China as the new leader of the world's market, we find ourselves then understanding further than Ezekiel the 1st chapter, or then the big machine of synchronisms as then we walk on until the starting of the autumn feast. So then, the autumn feast itself, it's a very interesting and intricate relation with Ezekiel the 1st chapter. Not only this, but we find then the information given on Galah or Revelation, it's not in fact in a chronological order. So then, let's try to evaluate what it means then the sounding of shofars. Then Galah we must then divide in a couple of sections. That is the section of sin and its consequences, and then the justice of the Creator. Those they can't mix. So then the Greco and the Romans, when they began to translate the holy documents, they did not understand the intricacies of these section where then you can't mix sound of shofar and sin. Let's give an example. The 8th chapter of Galah or Revelation states then the sounding of the shofars and then the destruction. Those are not related. In fact, the sounding of the shofar should obviously mention then the coming of the pouring of the cups only. These are the areas then we must understand the consequences versus extension of those consequences. The Creator is on the extension of the consequences, but not on sin themselves. Why do we say this? Because He's holy, and He does not mix Himself in His holy instructions with sin. How do we determine then this section? You have then the 8th chapter, you have the initiation of sin, you have later, in later chapters, or then when you read the cups being poured, adds then the vengeance. Rosh Hashanah speaks of a set of soundings, while then Yom Teruah explains then a period when the instructions were given. So let's understand then the sounding of shofars, because it's extremely important. As we read then the starting of the autumn feast is then the vengeance or then the judgment. It's not a judgment of initiation, is termination of a judgment. So then when we read the 8th chapter, the sounding of the shofar does not start on the 8th chapter. It starts then later, prior of the pouring of the cups. This means the sounding of the shofars when they are sounded in the holy cities. It's going to be after then both of the atomic bombs and the consequences thereof. This then places the entire Galah in its place. So then, the war regarding then United States and Israel, regarding then the time of the end and the preparation for both atomic bombs, you find then the burden of Arabia, they will receive then the height of 10 cubits, the size of the weapon. United States is going to be double of the size. So then, With this in mind, you understand then the combat situation taking place then after these bombs are then released. Not only then the combat goes on during the time and after, but then comes the spiritual consequences coming out of the pits. There is the consequences of the pit in Arabia and then also in China. Then when the situation has reached its peak, then comes the wrath of the population of the world. Then comes the sounding of the seventh shofar, where then the cup is then poured. So then we can't mix those. Then Golah or Revelation explains then obviously the vengeance. The vengeance explains of the judgment, but based from the consequences, and those consequences were started. The Creator simply finished them for the closing of this age. So then the new earth is then obviously renewed. So then the Greco and the Romans, when they translated, they did not understand the machine of Ezekiel, the first chapter. Yeshayahu the prophet knew, because he mentioned, and the Creator was then on the circle of the earth. This understanding is from the vision of this machine of the first chapter of Ezekiel. Both prophets, they had the understanding. Ezekiel had this understanding, but Ezekiel spent most of his time understanding tabernacling, and tabernacling of the end. Zechariah has very specific understandings and instructions for Golah. He was the prophet where the Messiah then drawn most of his understanding layered wise, and he explained then Revelation. So then, shofars related with sin makes no sense. If you try to find sin in shofars while reading Zechariah, you won't find them, because it was not relevant. The relevancy is then vengeance, and the sounding of the shofars related with the vengeance, and vengeance is the pouring of the cups. So then safely we can say, based from the prophets and their teachings thereof, these are then 490 days of pouring of cups only. Thus then the autumn feast. Though you have to have these sections of the war prior of the pouring of the cups to make sense, then the pouring of the cups later, understandably. But you don't count autumn feast with the sounding of the shofar and at the same time the starting counting, because it's going to be longer. If you count then the atomic blasts until the end is far more than 490 days, and it's not the second half of the instructions and the prophets. So then, because of the instructions were then put together in a very hasty way from people that did not have a clue what they were reading, then we have to establish these areas and then place them as per then the instructions of Ezekiel. So then the synchronisms can be properly placed. They did understand this point. So then, what Yohanan had done was precisely what then Yeshayahu had done while he was recording the holy instructions. It was very compacted. You have a mixture of consequences only of sin and the finishing of those areas for the closing of this age, thus vengeance, autumn feast, and the sounding of the shofars. The period prior of this time is then much longer. Then you can read Daniel the 11th chapter until you read the 12th. So then later, then you will understand what it means then the vengeance. The vengeance is mine simply is the set of pouring of cups. It's not the sins themselves. The Creator can mix himself with sin. So sin must take place prior, when the consequences are emotion. then the Creator finishes each of them perfectly. So then, please stay tuned. Much more coming up.